And then he'd had to deal with the question of what happens when someone begins to lose their nerve, like John the Baptist. And here we find this woman who is apparently entrusted herself, is willing to come and expose herself before everyone, before Jesus. And we're reminded that Jesus desires the affection of our hearts, as well as the faith of our minds. Now, of course, faith, we all understand saving faith, has an indisputable, indispensable intellectual component. There has to be knowledge of the one in whom you put your trust and one in whom you put your faith. There has to be assent to his claims about who he is. Remember, as he asked the disciples, but who do you say that I am? But there's also that trust component, the fiduciary component, sometimes called. But if it is just sort of if it's the same sort of trust that you put in your local banker, that the bank's not going to be robbed overnight, that's not really saving faith. There is an emotional component that we would describe as an affection, a heart affection, that describes true faith, because it is descriptive of the one who has been delivered, who's been brought out of bondage, who's been brought out of the slave market of sin and given new life. And this was her response to Jesus' presence. Well, it's not everyone's response, is it? Simon is there. You know what we said about the Pharisees? The Pharisees were the religious conservatives of their day. They were the fundies. They were people that, in many ways, I think you and I could identify with. They were hardworking. They were generally law-abiding. And they had a sincere interest in religious matters. They're not like the Sadducees, the free-wheeling liberals. They were not those who were making common cause with the political establishment, the Herodians. They were the religious conservatives. And Simon is sitting there, and this is what he's thinking to himself. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he spoke to himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet, you know who and what man or woman this is who is touching him. And actually it's very specific. It's touching in almost a sexual manner in his eyes. She is a sinner. This is the reaction of a self-righteous man. And Simon's attitude towards that woman was that of contempt. This woman, this sinner, look at it already. She's bringing her adulteries, her fornications, her prostitutions in here, into my home. And if he were a true prophet, he'd know what kind of wretched person this was that was making all this fuss when we should be talking theology. Because I want to catch it. Oh yes, he was a sinner. But Simon judged himself separate and upright. That's one of the things that you notice about the Pharisees. Remember later on, there's a group of them and along with the other members of the Sanhedrin, they cast a man out of their midst who had been born blind, and they say, you were born in utter sin. And they excommunicated him because he professed that if God was not with Jesus, he could do nothing. Remember that? You see, he decided that he was going to make her into an object. She's in a separate category from me. She's a sinner. And I'm separate. Righteous. Because I do the Torah. I do the things the Torah requires of me. But you know what? Simon's attitude towards the woman wasn't the only attitude of contempt that was there. Simon's attitude towards Jesus was equally contemptuous. Because you have to consider Simon's hospitality. Notice what Jesus says to Simon after he gives that little parable about the two debtors. He says, do you see this woman? Verse 44. I entered your house. You, Simon, gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You do not anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. the very basic things that were expected of a host when he was having a dinner party that he would do for his guests. That he would have the lowly slave in his house at least wash the guests' feet because they'd been out on the road. He neglected. He didn't give them any kiss of greeting. He didn't embrace them at the door. Another little ritual of anointing the guests' heads with oil. He neglected that. Far from being hospitable, Simon's hospitality was strangely lacking. It's because he had contempt for Jesus. And here he just lets the cat out of the bag. Well, if he were really a prophet, he'd know what sort of woman this is. You know, and I dare say that many of us, as much as we would be ashamed to admit it, we're not too far away from the attitude of Simon towards Jesus. Do you think about it? You think about our own hearts. When we accepted Jesus into our hearts as boys, girls, young men, college students. But how often do you meet with him? How often do you worship him? How often do you want to hear his voice? How often do you speak to him in prayer? We invited him into our homes, into the homes of our hearts and our minds. But then do we neglect him and we leave him standing in the shadows? You see, this is one of the things why the Apostle John has to say, little children, keep yourselves from idols. And you're thinking, well, why does John have to tell the people in the church? I mean, are they going to go and fall down in front of Buddha statues? No, I don't think that's what's going on. He has to say that because practical atheism is so easy to slip into, where we act and we think and we live our lives in everydayness as if God were not there and as if Jesus were not present. And we find ourselves to be good Simons, simple Simons, practicing the presence of Jesus today. It's not just a name of a book, but it is learning the reality that our life is bound up to His. His life has become our life. And the one who promised that He would tabernacle among men is the one who still knocks at the door of those who already know Him. Desires to spend time with you and I, His people. You see, Simon's theology was a theology that said that true prophets do not associate with sinners. True prophets don't get their hands dirty. True prophets don't deal with messy people, and they certainly don't let people who knows where they just have their hand. You know, I like to tell my kids, especially my youngest one, he's always looking for a snack, even if he finds it on the floor, and who knows how long. I wouldn't eat that. You don't know where it's been. Imagine that. This woman, I wouldn't let her touch you. You don't know where that's been. True prophets would know that, he says. They don't associate with those sort of people. God is for good people and not those whose lives are a mess. Well, let me suggest this to you. I want to suggest to you one of the reasons why. Let's turn the mirror in on ourselves for a moment. One of the reasons why Reformed churches tend to be, as Gary North says, Scary Gary, bottom feeders, waiting for someone who comes from another evangelical denomination that may not be so committed to more of an intellectual ministry, and we wait for them to come around so we can do the teaching, but we don't do the evangelizing. And I think one of the reasons probably is that we have almost sterile churches of lily white people who kind of look like one another. And you know what? If we had someone, dare I say this, what if we had an outrageous example? What if you had a Lady Gaga or Madonna walk in the door and come to church? Now, what would you say to her? I know some of y'all would say, let's borrow Dave's robe and get it on you first. And others would say, what are you doing here? But you know what? That's the problem. That's the problem when we would say, what are you doing here? Because we find that sort of separatistic mentality, that mind of the sterile church where we all look alike, we're all happy little homeschooling families. Nothing wrong with that, homeschooling. But where the rest of the unbelieving world looks at us and we look like the freaks and not them. And instead they see us, as some recent commentators described the prayer convention down in Texas that Governor Perry hosted, as a circus, a free-for-all. And maybe some people were a little odd. But they think we're all odd. See, Jesus made room for grace, where Simon had none. He didn't even have room to accept the possibility that a woman like this could actually be redeemed, let alone to go and seek someone like that out. His house was clean. You know, one of the things as a reminder here is that our grasp of God's grace towards you and I is seen in how we treat people that are on the other side. People who are unregenerate. People who do not know the Lord. People who are notorious sinners. And you know what I'm going to suggest? I'm going to suggest that most of us don't know a whole lot of really notorious sinners. We know some nice people. Now, part of that is we are living our normal lives, raising our families, going to work, and so forth. But one of the things that happens as we grow more and more into the church, you become saved, you go to church, you know, the Barna people tell us within a couple of years, you hardly have any of your old relationships and friendships with unbelievers. And the thought that some people that are really not like us, that have really messed up lives, could become a part of our fellowship, become a part of our church, makes some of us very, very uncomfortable. But I think that shows that we're a lot more like Simon than we want to admit. And a lot less like this woman who came and threw herself at Jesus' feet. You see, the reaction of the Son of Man was completely different. It's completely different to what you or I might have done. Jesus was not put off by her outward fleshly sins. You know, I think we almost have a knee-jerk reaction about sexual sin. You know, we look at, and this is a country where it is sex o'clock in America. It is, you know, constantly you're having sodomy pushed at you through every media outlet. Normalization of sodomy. And we look at that and we go, oh, that's vile, that's awful, that's terrible. And it is. And we get our hackles up. But you know what? Not many of us get our hackles up about embezzlers. Not many of us get our hackles up about cowards. Not many of us get our hackles up about just garden variety idolaters. Not many of us get our hackles up about liars. And you know, all those who are in the thrall, in the grip of those sorts of sins, the book of Revelation tells us that those are the ones who are outside the holy city, along with those who are the dogs, the sorcerers, the sexually immoral. It says a lot about you and I. Jesus did not flee from someone like that. Jesus knew those people. Jesus went among those people. How much more should we, if we are going to be like Jesus? WWJD. Then what is going to be your reaction to notorious sinners? Would you pray a prayer that said, Lord, I want you to bring some really messed up families in among us? Would you pray that? Are you willing to pour yourself out for their sake?